Hello, my name is Dr. Karen Morash. I'm the lead academic tutor on Rose Bruford's online BA Theatre Studies. And I want to talk to you today about upgrading, how to understand assignment briefings, and generally how to improve your results on assignments. By assignments, I mean a formal submission that you make, often at the end of a semester or a term, or sometimes in the middle, and it goes towards your overall result. So it's a formal assessment. It often involves what we would call academic writing, so something that needs to create an argument. Sometimes there's creative elements involved. We interpret writing in all sorts of different ways, but it's something that has a particular assessment criteria that your tutor or lecturer will use to assess your understanding of a topic and your ability to construct an argument and other skills in the same way. So I want to talk to you about what you can do to deal with some of the anxieties about assignment and how to improve your results in general. This talk was originally designed for our Rose Bruford students, who are all students of the performing arts, but it's broadly applicable to people in the humanities in general or even beyond. So the first thing I'd like you to do, if possible, to make this as interactive as possible. If you go to zeetings.com/upgradingrb on another device, there's a few polls that we'll be doing, which you can take part in. None of the polls are anything definitive in terms of gathering data. The main function of them is a reflective practice for you to think about your feelings about assignments, how you approach them, and so on. So it's not really something where you're comparing your results against other people, although as more and more people participate in the polls, there might be the opportunity for that. But it's just to get a sense of how you function with assignments. It would also be useful if you have a pen and paper, and if you have any feedback from previous assignments, it might be useful to have that to hand as well. So you can pause this video at any time, do the polls, and make some notes as well. So the first poll we have, and you can pause the video to do this, is just about your general feelings about assignments. So have a go at responding to that. You can pause the video while you're doing it and then move on. And we have a second poll just to warm us up before you get going into the actual presentation itself. And this is multiple choice, and you can have a think about what your tendencies are when approaching assignments. So again, you can pause the video, do the poll, and then move on. So let's take a look at what we're actually going to cover in this session. So we look at the function of assignments. Why do we make our students do assignments? And what can you get out of doing an assignment? How to read a briefing and understand what's required. Making good choices in response to a brief. Sometimes it's hard to know what to do. I use the word briefing and brief interchangeably, more or less the same thing. Using feedback to improve results, very important tool. Understanding assessment criteria and grade bands. This is kind of UK specific, but for those of you who are not based in the UK, there might be something of value in that as well. And by the end of the session, you should be able to, so these are what we call intended learning outcomes, and you may hear me refer to them throughout as ILO. So I've got intended learning outcomes for this session. You'll also have intended learning outcomes for your modules and indeed for your assignments as well. They're basically what we want our students to be able to achieve by the end of something. So recognize and interpret the vocabulary of assignment briefings. Understand the need to make connections between module ILO, so there's those intended learning outcomes, and your work. Examine your own work and recognize why it's received a particular grade. That's often a bit of a mystery for students. They read the feedback and they just don't understand the difference between a first and a 2-1 or a 2-2. And using feedback in a targeted way to improve your results. So feedback itself is a really important tool. So what actually is an assignment? Have a think about that. Maybe write down a few notes, what you think an assignment is, and what function it has to play within your learning. It's not just a way of measurement, but it is a really important tool that we have of measuring. So assignments allow tutors to measure your learning and skill acquisition. So some programs are very dependent on exams. In theatre and performance, we tend not to be so dependent on exams. Certainly in our program, there are no exams. The debate is out about the effectiveness of exams within the humanities. That's not a debate we'll have here, but assignments are pretty ubiquitous really across the humanities, because we want to be able to see how students have learned and how they can apply certain skills, not say within a space of 2 hours, but given them, you know, a long time, basically a few weeks, to respond to an assignment briefing. So keep this in mind when you're planning your assignment, because these are the things that we as tutors and lecturers want to see in your work. So we want to see evidence of module specific learning or class specific learning. We use the word module for class in the UK. So the way you show us that you've learned from the modules, that you use the vocabulary of the module, and you make specific reference to learning material. So it should be obvious from your assignment that you have been present, that you have been reading the material, that you've been engaging with the material. If you write an assignment that could have been written by someone who hasn't actually attended any of the module, then you're probably not going to do that well. So you want to see evidence that you can follow instructions. So that's a really key skill that most of us need in life. So we measure that by seeing how well you've paid attention to the brief and structuring your response accordingly. I've seen lots of students over the years who have written really fantastic responses, but unfortunately, they didn't respond to the brief, so they haven't done what we've asked. And as much as we want to give them credit for fantastic work, if it doesn't respond to the brief, we can't. Evidence of argument. So this is really important. Those of you who are theatre studies students will have hopefully attended Jane Richards' session on making an argument. It's also available on our YouTube channel. I'm not going to go into too much detail on that now. So if you want to know more, do watch that video. But we want to see evidence that you can make an argument. So you have to have an introduction, a well-structured introduction that has a clear thesis. So your thesis is your argument summed up in a sentence or two. You need to have a really well-planned series of subtopics, including counter-argument, where you argue the other side, and a robust conclusion. So planning is really important. You shouldn't just be jumping from one thing to another without a sense of flow. That's how you build an argument, by basically accumulating evidence leading to a conclusion. We want to see evidence of further research and contextualization and evaluation of those resources, and proper usage of citation conventions. So depending on which course you're on, we use Harvard at Rose Bruford. Other people will use Chicago, or there's any number of different types of citation conventions. But we want to see that you can use them properly, that you're using research robustly. So you've got to choose relevant and robust critical and primary sources. And by robust, I mean, there's got to be some credibility to them. They've got to be saying something important. They've got to be things that you've actually spent some time looking for and thinking about. It's not just something, you know, the first 5 things that have come up on a Google search. So you use them, but you also have to comment on them. So you can't just leave these resources to speak for themselves. You have to integrate them into your argument. You have to expand on what they say. If you're using a primary source, you have to analyze the quotation you've taken from the primary source. You have to be leading that argument. You don't let your sources lead the argument. That's really key. We need to hear your voice in this. We need to see that there is evidence of independent thought. And then make sure any resource you use, you cite it properly. Okay, otherwise you're getting into plagiarism and nobody wants to deal with that. Finally, we want to see evidence of technical writing abilities and awareness of style. So this is a tricky one for some students. And obviously there are students who have dyslexia or other issues with their writing. If you are dyslexic, hopefully you've taken steps to get reasonable adjustments so that can be kind of discounted from your overall mark. But when you emerge from your university degree, unless you have something like dyslexia, you should be emerging being able to have well-constructed sentences and well-constructed paragraphs. You should have good writing skills intact. So always aim for clarity and precision as opposed to kind of colorful and flowery academic language. So a lot of students do what I call thesaurus abuse, where they think, oh, this word sounds too plain and simple. I'm going to use a thesaurus to find a similar word, but they don't really understand the full context of that word. So just keep it simple. We're more interested in your argument than your flowery language, although we do want you to use subject-specific vocabulary. If there is a style guide for your course, and there definitely is one at Rose Bruford, make sure you read it, follow it, consult it regularly, check it again at the end. It will tell you things about, do you underline titles or italicize titles? Do you double space? What the margin should be, and so on. And we expect you to follow those style conventions and need to proofread your work. So make sure you give yourself enough time at the end that you can go over it. Because when even myself, I make mistakes all the time. I need to proofread. And if I don't, I'm handing in work that will inevitably have spelling, punctuation, and grammar mistakes. It's important to remember, though, that assignments are also tools for your learning. Okay, they're not just for us as tutors and lecturers to assess you, they're also a key way that you can enhance your learning. You're undertaking research, usually. You're developing your knowledge. And if you're not learning something by doing an assignment, you're probably not giving us the evidence we need. Okay, so make sure you treat assignments as just another way of you learning about your topic. For more information on the specific evidence that you need to provide for an assignment briefing, because as I said, they differ from course to course, make sure you go to the assessment criteria. So most programs will publish the assessment criteria that tutors and lecturers use. And that's a really good way of providing guidance to you as to what you need to do. Okay, so look at the vocabulary, for example. The vocabulary we use to get a first in some areas, for a 2-1, you'd have to be diligent. For first, you have to be comprehensive and sustained, and try to understand the difference between those things. So definitely get your hands on the assessment criteria where possible. Okay, here's another poll. So we're going to talk about approaching assignment briefings. So it's really good to think about your own practice in this. And even if you're not in university study yet, you're still in high school or secondary school, you'll still have assignment briefings. So it's good to think about what your kind of inclinations are. So pause the video and have a look at the options as multiple choice and reflect on what you generally do. And when you're ready, you can continue the video. Okay, so you've got the brief in your hot little hands. What's the best way for dealing with it, for approaching the brief? First of all, go back and read over or remind yourself of the intended learning outcomes, the ILOs of the module. They may be, if you're like us, printed at the front of your assignment briefing as a reminder. Not all courses do this, but you'll be able to find them somewhere. Or they may not be called intended learning outcomes. They may be called things like aims and objectives. Remind yourself of those before you start anything. Okay, get your highlighter out, either a real highlighter or a virtual one if you're reading a PDF online, and highlight the important words. That means they're going into your brain, they're sticking in there. What do I need to do? What do I need to prove? What do I need to show? So read the brief twice at least. The first time you'll get a general sense of what's being asked of you and the different options, but the second time or the third or the fourth will help you to understand the specifics. If a lot of times briefs will give you different options to choose from, 3 different questions or more that you can answer. So in the rereading, you're getting the sort of nuances of the different questions. So again, get that highlighter out, highlight keywords, make notes, write questions. The questions are important because you can ask your tutors questions about your assignments. You certainly can on our course, and we welcome that. If you don't understand something, far better to ask than to get it wrong. So if you have options, rank them in terms of the most to the least appealing, but do it in quite a reflective way. Think about why something is appealing to you and why something is not appealing to you. If there aren't options, play around with potential ideas. So sometimes you'll be given a briefing and there's only one briefing, there's only one option for you to do, write an essay, but you have a choice of topic. Okay, so you could write an essay that addresses Ibsen's work, or you could write an essay that addresses Chekhov's work or any other playwrights. So you play around with potential ideas. What would you like to write about? What do you already feel kind of secure about? What are you really curious about? And that curiosity might lead to a really fantastic piece of writing. Spider diagramming or other kind of visual tools might help you. And then again, rank the ideas in terms of most to least appealing. When you're doing your ranking process, consider the options that will allow you to show your learning efficiently. So it really is, as I said, we don't have exams, so we need to test that our students have learned something. And so you need to give us that evidence. So what is going to best allow you to present that evidence of efficient learning? Which option is going to be straightforward for you to research? So there might be a topic that's super exciting, but when you start looking for research, it's actually pretty difficult to bring things together. Unfortunately, that might mean another topic would be a better choice. You want to make your life a little easy when it comes to writing assignments. It's stressful enough. You want something that's going to allow you to show your own original and creative take on the material. So I mentioned this before, we want to see evidence that you're leading the argument. It's not someone else making this argument, it's you making this argument. You are coming up with your own independent, insightful responses to the material. So you've got to pick a topic that will allow you to do that. We're not interested in you just parroting back information that you've read. That might have been true when you were in school, but at university level, you need to be engaging with it independently. And importantly, you want a topic that's definitely going to keep you interested, but that is not going to overwhelm you. I can't even say it properly. So there's some topics that students feel so passionate about that they really want to write about, but they can't actually extract the emotion and the passion from the writing, and that sometimes then means a poor assignment result because it becomes much more personal, subjective than it should be. And you care so deeply about it that you're not taking a balanced approach. So you want something that's going to keep you motivated, but isn't going to kind of emotionally swamp you. And for some people, they may laugh at that, but often in the arts and the humanities, we do have a really close emotional connection to the work that we're writing about. And it's important to have that. But when we're responding to the work, we often have to kind of take an outside view of it as well. Often work in the arts takes an inside and outside view of it. So make sure you understand when you're supposed to be an insider and when you're supposed to be this kind of slightly detached, emotionally detached outsider. So at the end, reflect. Why have you made the choices you've made? Really important. We love reflection on our course. In fact, there's another study skill session that Cohen Ambrose did, all about reflection. I highly recommend that as well. So reflect on why you've made these choices. Were they out of fear? Were they just kind of random choices? You didn't know what to do? Is it really the right choice for you? Don't spend days reflecting on it. Spend maybe 20 minutes reflecting on it. So, because reflection can also be a way of procrastinating as well. So don't do that. But do have a good think about why you've made the choice you have. Okay, so you made your choice. You're ready to move on to the next stage of researching and writing. Now, most students undertake research first and then write. That's certainly the way that I operate. Some students research and write at the same time. Might work for you. That might not be the most efficient thing. The danger with doing that is that you may find yourself going down what we call a rabbit hole of research that is unproductive. But if you're trying to do it at the same time as you're writing, it's hard to kind of pull yourself out of that rabbit hole. So make sure you have a good idea of what you want to do before you begin your researching. So make sure you really understand the brief. A good thing you can do is to try to write it in your own words and compare it to the original. Okay, have you really understood that? And sometimes the act of writing means that the brief will sink itself into your head a bit more. And that's what you want. You want the brief to be front and center in your brain. You can even write it on a Post-it note and put it on your computer so that you constantly remind yourself of what you are supposed to be doing. Look up any terminology you're unsure about. And if you can't figure out what it is, ask. Never be afraid to ask. And never feel stupid about asking. We use a lot of terminology in academia, which is normal and natural for us, but particularly for new students, you might not really understand what we mean. We'd rather you ask the question than just kind of floundered around in the dark. If you aren't sure that you fully understand, seek guidance from your tutor. Again, particularly if you've received low marks for following a brief in the past. So our marking scheme does actually assess students on how well they follow a brief. So if you are one of our students, or another student who gets marked for how well you follow a brief and you've previously done poorly on that, it's worth having a chat with your tutor just to kind of confirm that you've really understood what you're supposed to be doing. Sketch out a loose plan using the brief as a guide. So sometimes, especially at level 4 or first year university, briefs will be a little bit more explicit in what they want you to do. So they might give you bullet points, they might give you subtopics. So make sure your plan aligns with those. You don't want to go off on a completely different direction. The brief will often help you to decide kind of how to order your topics and so on. Okay, and this will help you to be really focused with your research as well. So do that before you start writing, so you don't do that rabbit holing thing I was mentioning previously. Review previous feedback, very important. So do that before you start writing, because if you've had some useful feedback, then the things that you need to improve on will be front and center. You'll remember them. You can even do the Post-it note with that as well. So say you've had issues with paragraph construction in the past, you can put paragraphs. And so you're reminding yourself that you need to really focus on those things. When you've finished writing your assignment, go back to the brief again. So this is part of the proofreading process. Check that you've addressed all aspects of it. So you check your spelling, your punctuation, your grammar, your sentence structure, and you check that you followed the brief. So we'll do another poll, but I think it's also useful. You can pause the video for this. Just off the top of your head, or you could look back at some of your feedback. write down the comments that you frequently get. Have a think about that. Are tutors saying the same thing to you again and again? If so, those are the things you need to prioritize in terms of improving. And also write things down that tutors say to you in feedback that you don't really understand. As I said before, there's no shame in this. We don't all understand the language of academic assessment immediately. It's a learning process. So if there's things like that that you haven't really understood, write them down. Maybe ask your tutor about it. So here's a poll. This is about receiving feedback. So again, it's a chance to reflect on your own practices and think about maybe there might be alternative ways of approaching feedback. Pause the video, and when you're finished the poll, come back. Okay, so we're talking about feedback now. This is quite UK specific, although it might be broadly applicable to the ABCD grades you get in other countries. So as I was saying in the beginning, sometimes students get marks on their work or grades and they don't fully understand the difference between what a first and a 2-1 is, or a 2-2 and a third. And so I thought it'd be useful. This is slightly subjective. These are my own descriptions, but as someone who is obsessed with good standards in assessment and who spends a lot of time thinking about assessment, these are how I would categorize the kind of qualities of each grade band that we have in the UK. And so it's useful to think about the grades that you've previously received and compare it to this to help you to understand why you got those grades. So let's start with a third, and that's roughly equivalent to a D in other countries. So there's some awareness of the subject, but also perhaps a little bit of misunderstanding, a little lack of clarity. In terms of the response to the brief, the student might have got it a bit wrong, so it's an imprecise response. There's maybe a hint of an argument, but not much of one. And usually in a third, there's not much evidence of a thesis statement. And that thesis statement needs to kind of appear throughout. So even if maybe there's a bit of a thesis statement, it just disappears entirely. There's limited usage of research. So the student, again, might have just done a Google search, not really thought about the resources, and certainly hasn't picked any critical sources. And by critical sources, we mean people who are taking an analytical approach to the work. Okay, and you need those. You just can't have, you know, it's useful to have all sorts of different sources, and interviews are useful, and so are journal articles, but you can't have all interviews where you just have people talking about their work, because that's quite a subjective way of approaching the topic. You need to balance all these things out, and critical sources are really important. So if you don't have those, your argument's going to be quite limited. And poor citation skills as well. So they've either got the rules completely wrong or they haven't cited. That's getting into plagiarism if there's lack of citation. Don't think that you can kind of broadly paraphrase an idea from a book without citing the source. Even if you're not quoting, you still have to cite where you got that information from. And often we see major issues with style, spelling, punctuation, grammar, sentence structure, so on. So it'll be a tricky thing to read, just because of the technical aspects of the writing. Now, of course, some people will show certain characteristics of a third, but they might also show certain characteristics of a 2-2 or even a first. So, you know, you may be in the category of a third or a D in some areas, but not in others. So your tutor will balance out the mark. So for a 2-2, roughly equivalent to a C, the student will have a reasonably sound understanding of the subject. So there is some evidence that learning has taken place, but there's little development of the learning material. So it's this idea of, as I previously mentioned, of parroting everything back. So there's summary, generalized comments, but not an awful lot of analysis, not an awful lot of independent thought. So the student will respond to the briefing, but maybe some aspects of the brief will have a much more robust response than other aspects of the brief. There might be bits of the brief that they found hard and they kind of skim over. Some evidence of a generalized argument. Theater is good. Women are interested in writing plays about women. Those are quite generalized arguments. So there might be something like that. But it is an argument. There's something there. The student would make good choices with research, but doesn't necessarily develop it. Okay, so they've found some great sources, they plonk them in, but then they don't say anything about them. They let those sources speak for themselves. And there might be citation errors as well, but there is citation in place. There might be a few spelling, punctuation, grammar errors. Sentence structure and paragraphs are often a problem at the level of a 2-2. Students will often write very, very, very long paragraphs or really short ones. So have a think about the structure of paragraphs and how paragraphs work towards making your writing more clear, work towards creating a sense of flow in your argument. If this is a problem for you, it's worth doing a bit of research about what a paragraph is. And the same thing with sentence structure. If you actually don't know the fundamental aspects of sentences, look it up. There's lots of resources online for that. So we're moving on to a 2-1, which is a rough equivalent of a B. So a 2-1, a student who achieves this would probably have quite a good understanding of the subject, and there's the beginnings of independent thought and learning. So the understanding is solid, and every now and then they kind of branch out from what they've learned and start to show that, this has sparked something off, but that might not be consistent. The student sticks closely to the briefing, so has followed the instructions well. There is a thesis present, an argument present, and it's reasonably well structured. So again, there's a sense of continuity, of flow. Good choices of research and quotations from both primary and secondary sources, so a good mix of sources. But the student might be overly reliant on the research to make the argument. So again, this is about having your voice come in, about your voice dominating the commentary. And there might be some small lapses in terms of citations. So maybe your comma is not in the right place. Maybe you use italics where you shouldn't have used italics, and so on. At this level, there shouldn't be too many spelling, punctuation, and grammar issues, although some, inevitably. And sometimes the style can inhibit clarity. So this is what I meant earlier when I was talking about trying to sound too sophisticated, rather than just writing or speaking if it's a assignment that is delivered orally. Trying to kind of sound more sophisticated than you really are can lead you into trouble sometimes. So just keep it simple, be as clear as possible. Right, and finally a first, which is quite a wide range. In the UK, this is for percentages of 70 to 100. So it's there's a first, and then there's a really good first. So it's the same thing as A's to A stars, A pluses. So we have evidence of independent learning and analysis beyond the module material. Okay, so you've taken what we've given you and you've flown with it. It's sparked off all sorts of thought, an inspiration. You're coming up with really exciting ideas in response. So your response to the briefing is both creative and insightful. So creative doesn't mean that you're putting on a fancy costume and doing things like that. It means that you have used your creative thinking to reply to the brief in an interesting way. You want your tutor to be going, wow, that's so exciting what they've just written or said or done. So the argument must be well planned. I can always tell when someone's written a plan beforehand. So there should be evidence of that within the structure of your assignment. You want a focused thesis, not a generalized thesis. And that thesis should pop up all throughout. Okay, so I always say you've got to find 10 different ways of stating that thesis in slightly different ways. And the student is fully in charge of that argument, leading the argument, presenting a counter argument, but doing so in such a way that to not to undermine the core argument. And you feel that this is a really confident response. So excellent choices of primary and secondary sources. So again, a wide variety, but don't just stick everything in there. We want to see that you can make good choices, including definitely critical secondary sources, and clear and insightful development of quotations. So this is what I was saying before, where you don't just stick in a quotation and leave it sitting there. You develop it. You might challenge it, even if if you have the basis to challenge what someone else has said. You compare it to what another person has said. I was talking about how sources rub up against each other. Okay, so you're not just leaving them there. You're playing with them. You're developing them. And there should be very few or no lapses with citations at this level. And similarly, very few spelling, punctuation, and style issues. The writing is clear, consistent, well-structured, and a pleasure to read. There is something wonderful about reading a piece of writing like this. Maybe I need to get out more, but it brings me a lot of joy to read a piece of writing from a student that is beautifully constructed, creative, and it just shows that what they've learned over the last few months has just sparked off something really wonderful in them. And that's it, really. Hopefully this was of use to you. I do recommend that you go back, you look over previous feedback, you have a think and reflection on areas of weakness that you previously experienced. Think about how you might address those. If you don't know how to address those, seek help. That's what we're here for, really, your tutors and lecturers. Try your best to actually enjoy the experience. I know writing an assignment is generally stressful, but it doesn't have to be. With a bit of planning, with some enthusiasm about your topic, and just a really kind of turned on, engaged brain, it can be quite a, dare I say, fun experience. Hopefully, at the very least, this will help you to move your marks up a little bit. If you have any questions, you can always contact me via the Rose Bruford website. Look for Theatre Studies Online, or some of you already know my email address very well. And if you have any questions about the course itself and our approach to supporting our students, please don't hesitate to get in touch as well. Thank you.